Good. Okay, good. Thank you guys for coming. I'm Alex Massa with Initech Appraisals. I'm the owner of Initech Appraisals, and we're a division of a larger appraisal management company. And our division is actually the boots on the ground appraisers. We're the largest residential appraisal firm in the Houston market area. We've got 16 appraisers in Houston and then a couple in Austin. So I've got a class put together I do a lot of these classes. Actually, this is my 5th one in 6 business days.
Wow.
And last year I was doing a class for one of the movement mortgage loan officers, and a realtor came up to me and said that they would love to get my perspective on how they would list a property. And full disclosure, I've never ever been a realtor. I've been an appraiser in the real estate appraisal business for 20 years, and I thought it'd be great to put myself in your shoes, use the tools that I use to maybe make you a little bit better. So we'll start the presentation. I love this quote here by Zan Monroe that says, "Pricing real estate is mostly a matter of supply and demand, just like in every other industry, and telling sellers the price they want to hear may get you the listing, but it won't sell the home," right? So how many of you have encountered this where you're competing against someone and someone says they can sell it for much more than anything in the market area because they've got some magic fairy dust they can put on the house, right? So I think in this market, you're one of 3 types of agents. You're either the discount broker, right? If you're only charging 1% or whatever these discount brokers charge. You're this realtor, right? That says you can sell it for more than anyone else in the market area, which we know is not true. Or you're the most educated agent that they're going to interview. So I hope to give you some tips today on how you can be that 3rd one, because I think that's the category you want to fall into, right? Good. So let's talk a little bit about factors to look at when pricing a home. I think the first and most important thing you need to look at is, what is the seller's motivation, right? You get a call from a seller that's a friend of yours and realtor friend. I just put a contract on a house and it's contingent on me selling this house and I've got to close in 45 days. You're going to price that very differently than if someone calls and says, "Realtor friend, I've got 6 months to a year to sell. I'm in no hurry. I just want to get as much as I can out of this house," right? So figuring out what the seller's motivation is super important when interviewing someone for a listing appointment. The second thing I think that's important is figuring out whether you're in a buyer's or a seller's market. So we're in a small group, so we can get interactive. What do you think we're in right now?
Buyer's
seller's
market.
market? Yeah.
Definitely
Buyer's market, yeah. I think that's true. The other day, for the first time ever, I got a response that they thought it was a seller's market under a certain price point, which might be true, right? You get under 250 or 200, you've got a bigger pool of people looking. Those market areas might be more competitive, but I think we're in the buyer's market. Guess what? No one's told sellers this. I think last spring is when this market changed. From 2012 until last spring, it was a seller's market all the way. You know, properties going up, people competing, multiple contracts going on. And I think the next thing that you need to look at is, what have homes sold for? In the appraisal world, list price is fantasy, sold price is reality. But you guys as agents and us as real estate appraisers, we have the luxury of being members of HAR, and we can actually see what homes sold for. Everyone's got that app, and they think they know everything. So you're competing against sellers that got information off hard that's not accurate, because list price is not reality. The other thing you need to look at is, what are you competing against? What's active and what's pending? I had a realtor friend of mine at one point, when she would list a property, she would go into every single active listing in that market area, physically inspect it just to see what she was competing against. And then she would price the property. I don't think you need to do that, right? You've got access to HAR, you've got access to pictures, agent remarks. You could probably analyze it that way. And then the next thing, and I think this is really important, and I think this can be utilized in a listing appointment, is, what's the supply and demand for your particular market area? I know that HAR sends this broad statement that the supply and demand looks great, and we have got a 4-month inventory in the Houston market area. We're in a healthy market, but every specific neighborhood and market is different. Wouldn't you agree?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to give you some tools on how to figure that out. And these are the tools that we've got. This is probably the most difficult math we're going to do, but it's also one of the most important slides. And this is called the absorption rate. And this is how to figure out how many months of inventory you've got in your particular market area, okay, or neighborhood. Let's say, for example, you're in the woodlands of Carlton Woods, right? And you look at the research, and let's say in Carlton Woods, you've got 120 sales over a 12-month period over the past year. If you divide 120 number of sales in the neighborhood by 12, you get 10, right? That means that that neighborhood is able to absorb 10 sales per month. And the way to figure out your inventory in month supply is by dividing that number by the total number of active listings. So if you've got 80 active listings, like it's in this example, and you divide that by number of sales per month, which is 10, what do you get? 8 months supply. This is what you've got to keep track of right now, because what I'm seeing in a lot of market areas is inventory increasing. And technically, the definition of an oversupplied market is anything over 6 months, but every seller is used to homes in their neighborhood selling in 30 to 90 days. So their perception is if it's not selling in 90 days, there's something wrong. But you could be dealing with a market area that's got an 8-month inventory or an inventory that's increasing, right? So a few ways that you can use this. I would say if you're at a listing appointment and you've run this analysis for the neighborhood and that seller says, I need to sell this or want to sell this in 90 days and I want to get as much as possible. And if you already know you've got an 8-month supply, you can tell them, look, I've already run the supply and demand in your neighborhood, and we're dealing with 8 months of inventory in your neighborhood. If we're going to sell it in 90 days, we've got to price it competitively, okay? You have a property or a couple of properties that have been sitting on the market for a while. Have you run this analysis yet?
No, not that one.
Good. This is something good to run, and I think this is something that you can run every week and send it to your sellers and keep your finger on the pulse of what's happening in that market area. And if you keep them updated and you see that the inventory is increasing every week, the conversation to have with them to lower the list price to get more competitive becomes a lot easier, doesn't it? Okay.
Matrix actually has one of these reports too that you can run.
It does, yeah.
It's direct from Matrix, and you can plug in the neighborhood that you want to do it for or the zip code. If you don't want to just do a specific neighborhood, you can do it based on zip code, based on school district, and it can run this report.
So back to your point, and that's exactly where I was going. Matrix does do this, but it's up to you to kind of define your market. So one thing that I did last summer is I ran an entire zip code. I ran 77024, which is the Memorial Villages, and I got about a 6 or 7 month supply. But Memorial Villages has a wide variety of homes, right, from probably 700 to 20 million. And what I was noticing was that the higher priced properties were sitting on the market longer. So I ran that same zip code, 77024, but I set a marker at 2 million. So anything that was listed or sold over 2 million. Now, if you remember, all of zip code 77024 had a 6-7 month supply. Anything over 2 million
2 years.
was at 11 month supply. It was close. It's probably higher now. So a way to run this analysis, you can get a little bit, I would start broad, start in your neighborhood, and then start narrowing it down to what you're competing against in your neighborhood, okay? If you're dealing with a condo, just stay in the condo section of Matrix. If you're dealing with townhome, just stay in townhome. I think they're together, but just make sure you're clicking on that condo tab. Do I have any questions on this? Does anyone use this right now when you're at a listing appointment? You do? Good. You're one of
It helps set the expectation up front, right?
Exactly.
Because so many people have that expectation our market's been amazing for the past 3-4 years.
It has been.
30, 60, 90 days. If it's 90 days, it's stale, but not so much anymore. Like you said, a 6-month cycle is about normal, right? And so we're just now starting to level off and have a normal market again.
That's correct.
So
I think it's useful to do up front for your listing appointment. No other agent has said that they use this. I've presented this 30 times to probably 500.
Well, we have listing appointment training coming up next week, so you'll get to see how this gets worked in.
I just think it would be very helpful, especially if you're in an oversupplied market, to set the expectations. And that's what you want to do. Plus, you differentiate yourself from other agents because other agents are not doing this. And this seems like difficult math, but it really isn't. And I think your seller would be impressed that you actually analyze their market, not just to see what homes have sold for, but what's the supply and demand in the market area. So this next slide's not as important, but the reason I put it in there is because we're going to run through an example at the end and figure out what a home should possibly sell for. But that doesn't mean that that's what you list it for. So you've got to figure out, once you figure out what a home should sell for, what do you list it at? And that's the sale to list ratio definition. And again, Matrix does a fantastic job of producing this for you. And all it is a percentage of what homes are selling for based on their list price. So if homes are selling at 95% of list price in the neighborhood as a median, then you know that they're listed 5% above what the median sales prices are. Okay? You'll know what this is. I don't need to run through it very thoroughly. I get this question a lot, so we'll talk a little bit about Appraisal 101. How do appraisers make adjustments, right? And it's not some magic formula that we all utilize, but this is as simple as I could break it down for you. I found this slide from an appraiser in Maryland, and I pulled it because I just thought it was such a great visual example. We've got two homes that are identical. Homemade, 1,500 square foot home. This one had a 2-car garage and sold for $210, okay? We've got another home in that same neighborhood that did not have a garage and sold for $200. So what appraisers do, in order to figure out what the market's willing to pay for these features, we're doing an analysis very similar to this. It's called paired sales analysis. And we try and figure out what is the market paying for these features, okay? In this example, what is a garage worth in this market area? $10,000, all right. Do you guys know how much it costs to build a garage?
More than that.
30 or 40 grand. And this is kind of a typical value for garages in the suburbs, even inside the loop in some areas. So this is a great way to explain to your sellers when they hand you a list that says, listen, I just put 100 grand into this house, and HGTV told me it should be worth 200 grand more. What we do as appraisers, and what the market does, is we don't measure how much money was put into the house, we measure what is the market willing to pay for that. Another great example, you're about to put a pool in your house.
Oh, you heard that.
Yeah.
That's exciting, Terry.
Which is awesome, but you have to, and you already know, you spend $60,000 on a pool in a certain market area that may only get you 20 grand. This is how we make adjustments, but it's specific to your market area. This isn't some broad example that garages in all of Houston are worth 10 grand. They might be worth 30 grand in River Oaks and 10 grand in the Woodlands. Okay, so you've got to really look at what amenities you're trying to value in that market area and what are they worth in that particular market area. Because that's what we measure, market value. What is the market willing to pay? Do you have questions on that? I'm smart group. A lot of times when appraisals come in below the sales price, it's because the square footage is not correct on the county appraisal district. Who's experienced that before? Okay. We've got four, more than half the class here. So a few things that I want to tell you about that. When the county appraisal district goes out to the property, a lot of times they don't measure, or they can't measure, or they can't get inside the home. They don't know how big the second story is, so when they guess, they end up guessing very big. And the reason they want to do that is because they want the homeowner to come in and tell them, no, it's actually only this size, right? So a few things that you can do in order to verify the square footage, and realtors for the most part are not asking this. Ask that seller if they've had a prior appraisal done and if you can see a copy of it, because 95% of appraisals that are ordered, an appraiser is going to measure and put a sketch near the end of the appraisal. I think it's somewhere between page 25 and page 30. So you can verify it that way. The second thing you can do is ask that seller to review any builder plans, if they've got any. that are specific to that subject property. And you've got to make sure that they haven't added anything, and make sure that they actually finished out all the areas that blueprint noted. One thing that I like to do when I go out to a property and I come up with a different square footage, I second guess myself, did I make a mistake? Do I need to go back out and remeasure? And sometimes I do. But I like to pull up the property archive report and look at every sale and listing for that subject property ever that was ever listed on HAR. And a lot of times you'll see the original listing per builder, 3,000 square feet, and all of a sudden 5 years later, nothing was added. Per county appraisal district, 3,300 square feet, right? They're just guessing, they're guessing big. The last thing you can do is hire an appraiser. That costs money, and I know you want to try to avoid that up front. One realtor the other day gave a great suggestion. If you're going to hire an appraiser, make that something that's reimbursed at closing, right? A lot of times the seller doesn't want to pay for it. You may have to come out of pocket. Just get reimbursed for that. I don't know, is that a reimbursable expense?
It could be,
Could
yeah,
be?
yeah. You can bill the seller for it, but what I typically will end up doing too is just like laying it out and saying, hey, listen, we can do. You can also do. BK Designs can do the 3D Matterport tour, and it measures the house. So that's a little bit cheaper than a full-on appraisal, right? And you can do that to get measurements, but you just lay it out with the seller up front and say, if the measurements, if you're fibbing on this or HCAD is incorrect and you know they're incorrect, you can expect some turbulence during the appraisal period. And it really just depends on the property. If it's going to be a multiple offer bid more first day, well, they're going to pay above appraised value anyway, right? So it really just depends on the situation.
The appraisal is kind of like the last hurdle before closing, and you don't want any issues to arise at that time.
I think like in the $1 million market or the luxury market, I don't think that we're experienced enough to price those properties, and I require my sellers to get appraisals.
Good.
Yeah.
So our company does just a measurement service as well. You don't have to order a full appraisal to do that. And you asked earlier, can you do pre-listing appraisals? Yes, you can. Will they be able to use that for the closing? No, in most cases. But at least it gives you an idea. If you think property's worth this and the seller this, getting an independent third party might be helpful. We get a lot of calls on a weekly basis with agents wanting that. Okay. One quick example I did last year, townhome in Rice Military that was listed per county appraisal district at 4,500 square feet and selling for $450. And I went and appraised it and measured 400 square feet bigger and actually ended up appraising $50,000 more than the contract price, right? Yeah, exactly. That was my expression as well. Imagine if the seller caught wind of that. I'm sure they never got a copy of that appraisal. But how upset would that seller be with that agent for not recommending a $200 service just to measure? This is how you're pricing a property. I think it's probably the most important thing to know, besides what's going on in the market area, when you're pricing it, right? So just a couple of tips on that. This is great when the seller comes to you and says, listen, I know the average price per square foot in my neighborhood is $100 a foot, so we should just multiply that by my square footage, and that's what it should sell for, right? How many of you get that often? I've never sat in on a listing appointment, but I can just imagine sellers stating this. So I threw this example together a few years ago, and it's one way to show that the price per square foot method is not correct. We had 2 homes in the neighborhood that were by the same builder, same floor plan. It just happens that one floor plan was a little bit bigger in some rooms, right? But sold around the same time. Sale A, number 1, was an 1,800 square foot home that sold for $200, which came out to $111 a foot. At that same time, on that same street, hypothetically, a home that's 300 square feet larger, same bedroom count, same condition, quality, everything's the same, sold for $215, which comes out to $102 a foot. So why do you think that larger one sold for less per square foot than the bigger one? Does anyone have an idea? Is anyone married to a builder or know a lot of builders?
Married to a builder.
Okay. So if you ask your husband, why is this the case? He'll tell you it's economies of scale. The bigger it is, the cheaper it is to build. Okay? And that's reflected
Especially
in the
if you're
market.
going up, because you have one pad site for multiple stories versus a one story, which it's the footprint is bigger and costs more to build.
So, like in this instance, the pad site's the exact same size, right?
Not necessarily.
7,500.
This one would be, well, that's the site size. The pad
I see.
site would be
Okay.
right the foundation. This one's actually a little bit bigger. But even so, economies of scale still prove that it's cheaper to build that one. And you've all run a scenario where you run all the sales in the neighborhood and you see that the bigger ones sell for less per square foot and the smaller ones sell for more per square foot. And I would go in there with that sheet, that little hot list sheet showing that. And when they come up to you saying, listen, it's not based on the price per square foot method, let me show you why. If you look at the bigger ones, they sell for less per square foot than the smaller ones because it's economies of scale. So if we're going to run a price per square foot method, we've got to find sales that are very, very similar to yours. These are the ones that I thought were similar, and their average price per square foot is about this. It's still not the best way to do it, but at least that puts it in their head, like I can't just run an average, right?
At a certain point though, does it level out? Like obviously new construction, you're fresh off of like all of the building supplies and things like that. But
Yeah.
the older the neighborhood, I guess obviously not.
Is it
because it's built in
depreciation?
1990.
No, it does not level off. You'll still see that the bigger ones sell for less per square foot than the larger ones.
So what would you recommend then if you were doing the price per square foot method? How many square feet in variance would you find? 100, 200 square feet?
No one's ever asked me that because we don't appraise based on this, so I can't.
It's funny because agents
Specifically
price
comment
on per
on that.
square and
I
you
know.
don't price per square. It's like we don't.
But there's so many variables, and you know our office is in the loop. And if you go into the Heights, for example, and you've got two identical sized homes, but one's on the 1,000 square foot larger lot, that one's going to sell for $70,000 more than the other one. So if you're taking the price per square foot method, that's not taking into account the land size and the amenities that the subjects have. So in a perfect world, if you live in Dallas where they've got zoning and the homes are a lot more similar than they are in our area, because we don't have zoning in most areas in the Houston market area, you can use a price per square foot method. I think if you've got homes that are very, very similar, I would say within 5% of square footage range, and very similar amenities, lot sizes, condition, quality, then you might use that method and it be more accurate, okay? But one thing that I'm going to explain here is we can extract a lot of stuff out of this, and this is where the appraiser nerd mind comes in. So we can measure in this market area that someone's willing to pay $15,000 more for 300 square feet, okay? So when you do the math, 15,000 divided by 300, you get 50 bucks a foot. So in this market area, people are willing to pay $50 more for additional square footage, or $50 less for each for less square footage, okay, per square foot. And you see appraisals, I get this question a lot, why are you only adjusting $30, $40, $50 a square foot in the market area when homes are selling at 100? Because appraisers measure this, what is the market reaction for that additional square footage? It's kind of a cool little scenario analysis, right? Do you have questions on that? Is that helpful combating the price per square foot method on the listing? Good.
We have some agents that are up in Livingston.
Yeah? Okay.
So it's like a totally different ballpark. So just kind of throughout this, if you can kind of touch and like compare on like pulling comps from like 4 miles away.
Yeah, okay, so
You know?
I get a similar question in every class, and
Yeah.
it's unique properties is an entirely different class that we can talk for about 3 or 4 hours.
Right.
I'm actually preparing to put a class together in the fall to deal with unique properties
Okay.
and what you would do, how far should you expand, how far back in time should you go, what are you really looking for. But one thing we're going to talk about now is what are you doing when you're selecting comparables. And one thing that appraisers have to abide by is certification number 7, which states that the appraiser has to use the sales that are locationally and physically the most similar. So if you're in Livingston and the most similar neighborhood to yours or most similar house to yours is 4 miles away, that's okay. As long as you're taking into account any differences that there may be for location, right?
Okay.
You start expanding, like you go out half a mile outside of Carlton Woods, are you gonna get the same pricing? Much lower price point, right? So you've gotta figure out what that difference is. Okay.
I have that same issue where I'm at because I deal with a lot of farm and ranch.
Yeah.
And so I have very different properties that are
Yeah.
hard to pull comps on. So
Yeah.
if you have any insight on that, that would be helpful.
I would expand as, first I would go back in time. 12 months is what we typically look at. Okay?
For those type of properties, 12 months.
In certain scenarios, yes, if you've got a 12 months time span and you can find some comps, great. You can actually go beyond that. It's very rare. I've only done it probably 2% of the time I'm appraising, where I go beyond 12 months. But sometimes you have to. The other thing you do is you just expand your search, right? On acreage properties, I've gone as far as 90 miles, right? It just depends on the property type and what you're looking for. I had a scenario in Meadville where I had a barnuminium that was large, 3,000 square feet, and super nice on 10 acres. And I couldn't find another barnuminium until I got to Crosby, which was 90 miles away. But it was very similar in square footage and similar design, barnuminium, and same lot size. So one thing that I did is I ran an analysis. What is 10 acres worth in Meadville? What is 10 acres worth in Crosby? Identical, right? So yes, they're not very similar market areas, but their price point is very similar. So that was a comparable I had to utilize.
Are you taking school district into account, or are you just comparing areas and then by extracting that data?
By extracting that data, you'll see the differences in school districts, right? We're not technically allowed to make adjustments for school districts. Those lines can change,
Right.
right? But it's reflected in the market area, and you'll see it.
Can I ask another question? I'm sorry if this is like throwing you off your,
No, not at
your
all.
pitch, but what if a property could be residential or commercial and they want to market it as either or, but listing it as like, how would you?
Unrestricted, basically?
Unrestricted, but they want, it's residential currently, but would like to market it and list it as if it could be commercial.
Okay.
There's like a shop on it or something.
Sure.
So how would
I have that same situation right now.
how would an appraiser, would we let the appraiser know that that's kind of like what our
Yeah.
intentions are, or?
Yeah, okay, so the first question the appraiser asks when they go out to a property is, what is the highest and best use, right?
Okay.
Licensed and certified appraisers in Texas are only allowed to do residential properties. You've got to go to a commercial appraiser to value commercial property. So if I go out there, I'm a residential appraiser, if I go out there and I see that the highest and best use of this property is commercial, I can't complete that appraisal. And you have to price it with commercial-like comps.
Okay.
So that's one thing that you've got to ask yourself. Is it worth 200 as residential and maybe 300 as commercial? Then you've got to market it as commercial, because any appraiser that goes out there is going to say, this is highest and best use commercial. That's the only way you can get a loan on that, if they're going to get a loan on it.
Okay.
Does that answer your question?
Kind of. So if you wanted to list it as either or, then would I still need to get a residential appraisal done and then a separate commercial?
It depends on who's buying it, right? So if the person that wants to buy it would be using it for their home, we would order the appraisal as a residential appraisal.
Right.
Versus if the person that put the offer would be commercial, they would have to have their commercial
But
appraisal.
when you're pricing it in the
When
front,
you're pricing it though to list it, and
Okay.
you want to
Pricing,
advertise it
yeah.
as possibly a commercial property, then I wouldn't want to go off of a residential appraisal.
I can answer this. So back to, if you think it's worth more commercially, that's the only way you can do that appraisal. Okay. If it's priced similar residential or commercial, then there's really not a highest and best use issue.
Okay.
So I would go, if you think it's priced more as commercial, you've got to market it as that and sell it as that, because the financing is going to probably fall under commercial. Even if it's used as residential. Okay? There might be a workshop and they repair cars in the back, but they live in the house in the front.
Right.
But the value really is in the location of it and the use of that workshop. So you wouldn't be able to do a commercial loan, and if the highest and best use, based on the appraiser's opinion, is commercial, then that's how you've got to price it.
So what happens if we sell it as residential and a commercial, and an appraiser comes in and says this is the highest and best is commercial, then our buyer has to completely switch up
They
their.
do, yeah. Fannie, Freddie, FHA will not accept commercial properties. So,
So the appraisal could throw the whole thing off if the buyer wants to use it as residential.
yeah. If the value, someone might be wanting to buy a workshop that has a little quarters on top and say, I'm gonna live in it, but it's still a workshop. And that's the highest and best use of that improvement. So Fannie's guidelines won't allow, and Freddie and FHA won't allow us to appraise that if the highest and best use is commercial.
Okay, good information.
So at that point, then the lender you guys would tell the lender, no, we can't appraise that, and then
Correct.
they'd have to restructure the loan.
Well, we couldn't, we can't, like,
Do commercial,
commercial,
yeah.
Mhm.
so they would have to go to a commercial.
Typically a bank, right? At that point, you're going to a
Yeah.
bank, not a mortgage lender.
That's very interesting though, because, you would want, if it was worth so much less as residential, you can't have two prices, cause someone will come in and say, I'm gonna live there, but really they want it for commercial, but they wanna pay less, so how do you combat that?
Yeah, I don't know.
I don't know either. I think your seller has to decide,
Right.
because it might take a lot longer to sell it as commercial versus selling it as residential.
Mhm.
Very
You
true.
know?
But even at that, even if it's sold at that residential price, if the highest and best use is commercial, you still won't be able to get a loan on it.
Mhm.
Okay. It just depends on the property. You're gonna come across some. What is it that you've got listed right now?
Basically the same thing that you just, so I've got this ranch property on 5 acres, but
Yeah.
the side property has a workshop that they would like to market it. It's on a busy street on 290
Yeah.
or 2090, I'm sorry, and they want to market that shop, could be like a tire, like a car repair shop or whatever.
Yeah.
So they plan on marketing it that way, it could be commercial, it could be residential, it could
Yeah.
be great for like a small fixer-upper or whatever, car shop. So he also did mention too, though, that we talked about maybe not subdividing, but like separating the
workshop.
lot
Yeah.
and sell it separately from.
Replatting it.
Yeah, so that might be an option too if it's gonna be.
It still might be that the highest and best use is residential. A lot of acreage properties have big workshops,
Right.
and it's not always used for commercial purposes. It could be used for storage, so it's kind of subjective in the appraiser's mind. But being on a busy street, if they actually were using it commercially,
They're not now.
yeah,
It's just like
exactly.
a hobby thing
So,
for him right now, but
yeah.
he thought it would be a good selling point that anybody could come in and start their own business there.
It's possible, but that may not change the value of it, so there might not be a highest and best use issue. It may be worth the same either way.
Okay.
Okay? Cool, so let's talk about real quick, how much time do we have? 15 minutes. Are we done at 12:30?
We're good.
Yeah? Okay. Let's say that we're going into a neighborhood. Now we've got some cool basics and cool formulas that we're going to utilize. What do you do in the price of property? So I think location is absolutely the most important thing. And one thing I would suggest is using sales from your neighborhood, your market area. I'm going to use, do y'all know where Westbury is? Okay, so let's use Westbury as an example. If you're selling something in Westbury 4, you might pull up the whole neighborhood, which is going to be 5 sections. Westbury 1, 2, and 3 are at a higher price point than section 4 and 5. So even location within a subdivision becomes important in figuring out, is my section worth more or less than these other sections? So that goes back into location, figuring out which sales are the most proximate and similar. Okay, so what I like to do, and we'll run through that example, is map all the sales and then start looking. The next thing you want to do is look at homes that are similar in square footage. And what I do when I'm appraising is I look at a square footage range of plus or minus 20%. Okay? And then I narrow it down. So 20% compared to the subject property. Other things that you look at, obviously condition and quality, age, amenities, and lot size. And those can all be in different order just depending on the market area, right? In some market areas, land is more important than square footage. So I ran through an example in my neighborhood. I live in Berkeley Park. If you know where City Center is, Memorial City Center. I live near there. This is where that neighborhood is, Briar Grove Park. And what I did was I pulled up all the sales and actives in that market area over a 12-month period to first figure out what my absorption rate, what's my supply in this market area. I had 84 sales over the past 12 months, which if I divide that by 12 gives me roughly 7, and then I divide that by 40, and that gives me right between 5 and 6 months supply. So I'm right on the cusp of being oversupplied. And remember how I talked to you about checking every week what's going on in that market area? I ran the scenario in the fall. In the spring, there was about a 2-month supply in my market area. Okay, so between the spring and the fall, it's increased that much. So the next thing that I do, and this is important if you've never sold a home in this neighborhood or any neighborhood that you're looking at, I mapped all the sales. And visually, this gives you a good idea of, are there boundaries that surround this or that cut this neighborhood where the price points might be different. And if you look, Briar Forest goes right down the middle of this subdivision. And if you run an analysis of the homes south of Briar Forest compared to the ones north, the ones south sell for a lower price point than the ones north. For many reasons, lot sizes, the appeal, the privacy, it's a little bit more private with the Briar Forest. So if you're in a market area and you're on the south side of Briar Forest, and you start pulling comps and you see that all the high ones are north of Briar Forest, that's a trigger, like, are there locational issues even in my own subdivision? Okay?
Are you taking any flooding into consideration with that?
Yeah, but in this hypothetical example, no. We're talking a little bit about
Say that area
yeah.
right there was like salt and pepper.
Yeah. So yeah, there was a little pocket right here that flooded during Harvey. This is for example purposes only. So this is the subject property that I selected. We're going to go through an example of what this property should have sold for, where it should be listed. So it's a property that listed for $679. It was 61 square feet on a 9,300 square foot lot. And a little bit about this property and what we do is I like to look at the age of earmarks to see what condition it's in. I like to look at pictures of the comps to see what condition they're in. So we're going to look at just a couple of pictures of this subject property. So it's a ranch style, nice home. It's got some updates, some braided countertops, and based on the color of the countertops, it was probably remodeled in the early 2000s. Some stainless steel appliances and some cool old school terrazzo flooring, right? I haven't seen that since middle school, but yeah, it's cool. It's got some bathroom updates, and I just wanted to give you just a snapshot of what it looked like. So then what I did is I mapped where the subject property was, north of Briar Forest, and then I started running my comps. I did the 20% range of square footage, so I really ran any sale north of Briar Forest, going back 12 months, that sold between 2,000 and 3,000 square feet. And I got about 14 hits, which isn't that many. And what I ended up doing is, like that realtor I knew, I opened up every comp, I read all the agent remarks, I looked at every picture, and I selected the sales that I felt were the most similar to the subject property. In fact, 3 were similar, one's a curveball, it's not really similar, but you're always gonna have that one that's thrown at you by a seller that says, well, my house is that square footage, why can't we sell it for that? Well, because it's a lot nicer, right? And then I mapped them, obviously, so you can kind of get an idea. I've done the homework for you. I selected the sales that I felt were the most similar. So now we've gone broad, looking at the whole neighborhood. We've narrowed it down to north of Briar Forest, and now we've narrowed it down to square footage range. Now we've narrowed it down to the ones that are the most similar. See how we start working our way down? I'm sure you do this when you're doing CMAs, right? Mm-hmm. So comparable one was a home that sold for almost $600. It was a little bit bigger than us, a little bit bigger lot. A couple things about this house. It had a quarters feature but no garage. So you're gonna have comps that have different features, and you gotta figure out in that market area, what are those features worth? And hypothetically, we use that theory that I gave you, that paired sales, where you compare and contrast to see what the buyers are willing to pay in that market area. But condition-wise, would you say that's similar to the subject, just based on photos? Yeah? Okay. Sale number 2, $575 sales price. Do y'all remember what we were listed for? $679. Okay, see where we're going with this? GLA was 2,500 square feet, a little bit bigger lot, and this one had a pool, which the subject did not have. But condition-wise, would you agree with me that that's pretty similar?
Kitchen needs to be redone, but they did the bathroom.
Yes.
So it looks like they did the bathroom, not the kitchen.
I feel like, yeah, this one almost looks a little bit nicer though when you look at like the bathroom and the wood floors. So, I don't know.
Let's just assume that it's somewhat similar.
Yeah, sorry.
That's okay. The third one, this one sold for a little bit more. It was a smaller house, very similar lot size. And if you look at it, I would say it kind of looks similar to the subject property, but hypothetically, this is where agent remarks become important. This one may have had a new roof, new electrical, new plumbing, which in some market areas becomes very valuable. Especially in this market area, if you redo the plumbing, that saves that buyer 25 grand, because these homes are 50 years old and they've got that galvanized plumbing. So this one sold for a little bit more than that. And remember how we did the paired sales analysis to figure out garage count? That's what we do for condition as well. Okay? Comp 4, what do you think?
Much nicer.
Much nicer, right? So in this hypothetical example, this home was gutted to the studs and redone. They probably spent 200 grand redoing this house. And it's sold for $705, so obviously the market's willing to pay a lot more for a remodeled house. But it's very similar in square footage and very similar in lot size. So your seller's gonna say, well, this home, Johnny down the street sold for $705 and it's the same square footage as mine. Why can't we price it at that? This is where fantasy and reality set in when you start showing pictures of what these homes sold for. And if they still don't agree with you that this home is nicer, they're just delusional. I can't help you in that scenario. Okay? But you're gonna have that curveball, and I think you just go in there, not only with the CMA, but with pictures of what these homes look like.
So would you still use that one and then depreciate it?
I threw it in there because in some scenarios you're gonna have to. You're gonna have to figure out how much are those upgrades really worth in this market area, right? I told you they spent 200 grand, and I'll show you what that market's willing to pay for those upgrades, updates. So this may look odd to you, but this is what appraisers look at every day, and it's just called the appraisal comp grid. And this is where we line up the subject property on the left and compare it to the comps. And we're adding and subtracting for the differences, right? So I'll run just through a couple scenarios, examples. Comp 1 was a little bit bigger. We figured out what the GLA adjustment was in that market area. I think it was roughly $50 a foot. Subtracted that, right? We made an adjustment for the garage in this market area for that sale because that one did not have a garage. But what's important is this number on the bottom. That number on the bottom is the after adjusted value of that comp, and that is showing you normalized compared to the subject property what that comp is worth in that market area after you make the market adjustments. And that number is important because an appraiser's value has to fall within that range of the after adjusted comps, okay? So the curveball, comp 4, everything was very similar except for the condition. In the market area, running that paired sales analysis, those changes, upgrades, updates were only worth $150, even though they may have spent $200 or $220. Okay, that's where you measure the market reaction, not the cost put into the house. Okay? So what do you think our subject property is worth? After seeing all these numbers, the range is from 543 to 568. What do you think that home should have sold for?
550.
550? There's, yeah. I thought somewhere between the 550 or 560 range. Do you remember what it was listed for?
679.
679. Okay, so I'll give you, I'm going to defend the listing agent here. And it's an important lesson for all of us to learn.
Did the listing agent get it under contract?
No. They terminated.
Right?
They terminated, they ended up leasing it.
Okay.
Okay? So, what happened to, first let's figure out what to list this for. So we think it's worth somewhere between 550, 560, that's the value. Then that's when we use that sale to list ratio for the neighborhood, right, to figure out what to list it for. In this neighborhood, it was 5% of list price. I think they're selling at 95% of list price. So we would probably price it on the listing 5% higher than 550, 560. So maybe 580, 590 range. Okay, let's talk about the mistake that this listing agent made. And it's something that's out of his control. This property was listed in the fall, spring of last year at $679. And I knew this home, and I saw right when it went on the market, it was a friend's brother's house, so I kind of analyzed it in my head, and I had a number in my head at that time of around 625, 630 is what it should have sold for at that time. Now they listed it very, very high, and what happened was the market started, the supply started increasing, right? And it turned from a seller's market to a buyer's market within the time frame that it was listed. So had they listed it properly, I think it would have sold in a couple months, and they would have gotten in the 620 to 630 range. But they listed it at 680. If the sale to list ratio was only a couple percent, they should have probably listed it at 635, maybe even 640, and they would have moved it in a couple months. Instead, the market shifted on them, and now it's only worth what we assessed it at, right? Somewhere in the 550, 560, 570 range. So you got to be cautious to not overlist properties. I know you're going to be tempted because your seller's saying, well, why don't we just try that? If you do, and you get caught in a market like this, or the inventory is increasing, you're going to miss out on a valuable time to sell that. If they're calling you, they're already motivated to sell. Okay, so it's your job to show them how they can do that and how they can do that quickly and not get caught in something like this.
Question.
Valuable lesson. Yeah, we can take questions now.
Do you guys take into consideration, like, do you look at the trend in property value and tax value increasing over the previous, like, if each year
They
property
increase,
values
yeah.
are going up $20,000,
Yeah.
do you take that into consideration when you do the appraisals?
No, absolutely not. And the reason why is because a lot of county appraisal districts for a long time were so much lower, and they've got a limit on how much they can increase it. So you might still have a declining market area, and the county appraisal district still might keep increasing it because they can. Do it up to 10%. And it still might be below what the actual market value is, but we don't take that into consideration. What we do take into consideration is if a market's increasing or decreasing, we actually run an analysis over a 12-month period from the date of the appraisal to determine that. So if we see if a market's increasing in value, there are adjustments that we can make to account for, let's say I use a comp that's 11 months old, but now the market area has increased 10%, I can make an adjustment to reflect that
Okay.
in the appraisal. Okay? So we do take into account fluctuations in the markets, but not related to what the county appraisal district says. Any other questions? I ran through it quick because I didn't have that much time. Usually this is like an hour and a half presentation, but I wanted to get y'all's questions answered. Little recap. Now you know how to do the absorption rate, figure out the supply and demand, right? That's something you can add to your listing presentation. Figuring out the correct square footage. No other realtor is going to ask to verify that, so that's great. Figuring out the motivation that they've got, and a couple of suggestions on when you're taking in your CMA and you're showing them the comps that you think are good. I would also pull that list of all the comps in the neighborhood. That way, if the price per square foot method scenario comes about, you can show them These are what the bigger sales are selling for per square foot. These are what the smaller ones are selling for per square foot. I'm trying to think what else you could ask for.
Do you ever negatively hit a property because of time on market? So say, the market shows that it was only 30-day
Yeah.
market, right? But this one is sat for 6 months. So is it less desirable in an appraiser's eyes, and would you negatively hit that, or?
We'll look at different scenarios. We won't negatively hit that just for sitting on the market for a long time, because it could have either been marketed poorly or listed too high. And so there's so many other factors in that scenario. So no, the short answer is no.
When I stepped out, did you already talk about flood houses?
No, I did not. Do you all want to talk about flood
Yes.
houses real quick? Everyone's asking me how much is the flood affecting the market area. It just depends on the market area. I'll tell you, in Meyerland, before Harvey, you could buy a 10,000 square foot lot for $350. Those lots are now selling for $250. So in Meyerland, just the lot value loans decreased 30%. What I'm seeing in the market area, and I thought that subdivisions where there's a few homes that flooded or half the homes that flooded, that the rest of the market area would actually increase. And that wasn't the case, because me as an appraiser, I'm only good at predicting the past, right? I can't predict the future, so I was wrong in that analysis. One thing I will tell you, if you've got a flooded property that you're listing, is you've got to provide another comp that is flooded, remodeled, and sold within your market area to prove your value. So you can't just use comps that have not flooded to compare to the subject property. And now, in pretty much every scenario, there's been at least 1 or 2. So that's kind of a benchmark.
We had a situation, you and I actually had a phone call back in, this was East, remember? The East property? I was all fired up about it because it was not necessarily shortly after Harvey, but it was the first 100% renovated down to the gut house. Yeah. And the appraiser came in and used non-flooded homes that hadn't been updated, right? And so we got a negative hit because their defense was that they extracted data because the neighborhood showed that the neighborhood took a negative effect.
Right.
But all those homes were 1970s, never updated, right? And this one was first day on market, bid more, gone. And most of them in Kingwood that have been renovated like that, that market is like that.
Right.
So the older homes that didn't flood, boom. Market crashed. Flooded homes, boom. Everybody likes them because they want the 100% renovated nice houses, right? They don't have to pay for the renovation.
Yeah.
So I felt like my client got a double whammy because, and I had the buyer, but I was so upset for the seller in that market because I care so much about that community, right? It's like, how can we ethically extract data from a neighborhood and compare it to non-flooded homes when that, like, it's just not even a comparison.
So
then are you giving me credit for granite and Thermador and, everything else? No.
So that was the challenge when it was the first one in that market area, right? And now you've got data to show that. And what we were doing when you were the first one in that neighborhood is we would have to go back to past flood events to see what the market extracted for flooded homes. Or I think in that scenario, I don't remember if that was the scenario where we compared it to what a distressed sale would sell for that was in need of remodeling. I don't remember how we extracted that. But our challenge was to figure out how did that affect the market area, right? Because let's say you've got 2 homes in the market area, one that flooded fully remodeled and one that did not flood fully remodeled. Which one would a buyer most likely take? Probably the one that never flooded, and how much more would they get for that? So
it's interesting because in certain markets, I don't think it matters.
It doesn't. In some markets now, the market's reflected that they
like
don't care.
Braeswood, Meyerland definitely, but like Braes Heights, I mean, there's doctors and attorneys who you would think they'd have more common sense. They have the book sense, right? But they're like, no, I don't care. I don't care. I'll just take my cars up to the hospital and park them and rinse the garage out.
So what kind of weight do you put on Harvey, which is like a one in a lifetime event versus other flooding events, Harvey, does that impact more or less?
But does an appraiser even have that history to know truly how many times?
I mean, in Houston, you
might.
There's been so many.
Yeah, here's the scenario there. So you've got some homes in, what's the south part of the Woodlands now that's in Creekside. Creekside. Okay, so you've got some homes that are only 5 years old in Creekside that flooded during Harvey. You've got homes in Riverstone and Sugar Land that are only 5 years old that have flooded during Harvey. So yeah, it's a one-time event for now, but these homes are only 5 years old and have already flooded. Could this happen again? Maybe, yes. So those homes might be more impacted than the ones in my neighborhood. They've been there for 45 years and never flooded, right? So they've got a longer history. But at the end of the day, now all we're doing is measuring as best we can what the market is willing to do. I think I remember the property that you're talking about. It wasn't me, but it was someone in my office.
Someone in your office did it, but you and I had a long
Yeah.
call about it.
Yeah.
Because I was like, no, this isn't right.
Yeah.
Please
And
explain to me.
Yeah.
That's just the way, I remember that he had some support for how he figured out what an adjustment would be percentage-wise in the market for a home that flooded. Even though it may not have been right at that time, that's
Right.
all the data, the
Yeah,
only data point
absolutely.
we
That's
have.
all you can take.
Yeah. And that's our job, is to prove it in the market. And if I send a home like that to the lender and say there's no market reaction, I've got to be able to prove that. So now
Well,
it's
can I just
easier.
say, you have a thankless job, and I'm so glad it's you and not us.
Yeah, it's
It seems like you probably don't get too many happy customers.
yeah.
You hear from people that are
Maybe,
angry.
yeah.
If it comes in below the sales price, we know the anxiety that causes everybody in the transaction, right? And we don't like to cut deals, coming in below the sales price, because that creates a lot more work for us. You guys are going to send us 1,000 comps to look at, and that's work that we're not getting paid for. So our office is a little bit different because we've got a review appraiser. So if something comes in below the sales price, we've got another appraiser kind of looking, did we miss anything? We don't want to ruin deals. We get a copy of the contract. We know what the sales price is. We're trying to hit it if we can prove it. Now the other thing is all our reports are going into a database that Fannie, Freddie, and FHA have. And they're grading our appraisals based on the data that we're putting in there and assessing it with a risk score. And if we don't use the sales that are locationally physically the most similar, we could have complaints filed against us. So appraisers are appraising scared. So in your scenario, we've got a flooded house.
I remember exactly what it was. So we had only used comps that were post-Harvey, right? So they were already post-Harvey comps, which should have reflected what the market had already done.
Yeah.
And then we had a negative hit. So I felt like it was a double whammy because then we had a negative hit because of previous extracted data with what the market will do.
Yeah, I
and like, how can we do that? Because we're already comparing it to post-Harvey comps. I think
Did y'all close it anyway?
Crazy situation. Here's
Yeah.
the thing, the buyers were using meds, I believe, and then the buyer's father stepped in and said, I'll pay cash for it.
Oh, wow.
So it ended up not even being an issue.
Yeah.
But for that market, for Kingwood, because I do a lot of listings there too, I'm like, no,
Right.
this is a really solid comp for all of us to move forward.
Yeah.
Because the first one that comes in determines what everybody else does.
Yeah.
So it's like, okay, if we get hit hard on this one, then everyone has to build on top of that.
Yeah.
It's going to take longer for that market to recover.
Very, very much the case. Was it like in the 400,000?
It was right at 400.
Yeah, I think I remember that. I think I remember talking to you and the listing agent. You were
Yeah.
the seller?
I had the buyer.
Buyer's agent.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is weird, right?
Yeah.
But again, we have so much vested interest in that
You
community.
know, it's an opinion, and in a scenario like that, every appraiser was being conservative as heck.
Yeah, sure,
Right.
of course.
Because we didn't want them to come back 2 years later when they tried to sell it for 400 and we're only getting offers for 300, and saying, why didn't you make an adjustment for having flooded, right? Well, this is the best data we have. We have a data point that we can prove it. But again, it becomes difficult, and you're right, thank God that one sold high, because Fleetwood, if y'all know where Fleetwood is in the energy corridor, their first sale was terrible. And it was a very smart, savvy investor that knew that there were so many homes that were purchased by investors that were going to be flipped, that it was going to cause basically, no pun intended, a flood of inventory.
It still is over there. A lot
Still
of them are
is.
in VRBO.
Yes, okay, so
They're making
so
a killing.
he was the first one to get it on the market, get it sold. He wanted out as soon as possible, and ruin the market for Fleetwood because that's the first data point. And now what we're competing against is, well, now you've got different variations of remodels, and the ones that are super over improved become even more difficult to price. And I think that one was very, very over improved for that market area.
Do you remember what street it was on?
I don't remember. Yeah. Was it in like Pinehurst something? No.
I don't know. I
Yeah.
had one in over in Fleetwood and we couldn't sell it. He ended up terminating with us.
Yeah.
It was the one that was staged that y'all love so much.
Yeah.
He ended up terminating with us and going with someone else, and like
Yeah.
6 months later still hadn't sold. He ended up leasing it.
That's where the supply and demand comes into place, and you have to be a savvy realtor and know. I know a lot of investors purchasing here, which means that they're going to flip these homes, right? So there's going to be a lot of inventory that's beginning to get out quick. And what happened is a lot of them took them off the market and started renting them, but then there's a oversupply of rental homes, right? So I think that's it for the Hardy Talk. Real quick, let's talk about what to provide the appraiser when they come to a listing.
Yes.
Right. List of upgrades and updates and when they were done is super important. Appraisers want to know, there are a lot of things that we don't look at because we're looking at cosmetic stuff. A CMA, but you guys as realtors, the CMA is great, and it shows you what sales are good and what should be utilized. But one thing that I would do is also show them what sales are not good in the neighborhood and why. Let's say the home next door is identical, but it was a bad divorce case and it was a distressed sale, and you know that, but it's not listed anywhere in the agent remarks. As an appraiser, we're going to look on HER for comps. If we see that one and it's the most similar, we might put that in the appraisal and give it a lot of weight. So along with the comps that you think should be selected, also explain which ones shouldn't be and why. Yeah, does that make sense? Make sure your contracts are executed. Megan's going to tell you that because that could delay the appraisal process.